911, state your emergency.
I see terrible, horrible things. I see terrible, horrible people doing terrible, horrible things.
Okay, first we'll need some more information. How do you know that the things they were doing were terrible and horrible?
Okay, there's actually a lot of ways to answer that question. But first, we've got to avoid a few little games that our mind likes to play with us. Those are ethical theories that make it impossible for us to have a conversation about the difference between right and wrong. So consider egoism. When it's tricky, we call it psychological egoism, and that's the claim that each and every choice we make is consciously or subconsciously driven by potential gains for me, or maybe my loved ones, my friends, perhaps people I can use. If you disagree with this theory, then you're someone who believes in altruism. That's the idea that sometimes I do things that are selfless, just for the benefit of others. So, for example, I love this story I saw on Reddit. We've had some flooding recently, but when floods recede, fish get stuck on the banks, and so some guy went and spent the day throwing the stranded fish back in the water. Totally selfless, right? I mean, he had nothing to gain from throwing the fish back in the water. The egoist says, not so fast. First of all, fish stink when they die and rot, so he was saving the trail and himself from having to smell dead fish. Second, maybe it happens to make him feel good. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you do good things, you feel good. And the egoist is right about that. Okay, let's work with a harder case. How about the guy who turned over footage from Ahmaud Arbery's death? That guy, the cameraman, is now being charged for murder. So what did he get out of it? The egoist might say, I don't know about you, but something like that might weigh heavy on my conscience. Or even more likely, that guy didn't see that murder charge coming. Okay, so let's now talk about relativism. That's the notion that every culture views things differently, so we can really only judge within our own culture. In some cultures, polygamy is okay. In other cultures, eating dogs is okay. In some cultures, I'm not wearing enough clothing in this picture, and some cultures think it's horrible that we eat cows. The problem is that the term culture doesn't really have a rigid definition. It's a lot of things for a lot of different people. So, for example, I'm a Methodist. So maybe I can only judge the activities of other Methodists. But then again, I'm also a city dweller, and some city folks see Methodism different from rural folks. So I'm a city-dwelling Methodist. And also, I live in the 21st century, so I can't really apply my values to the values of Methodists from 100 or 200 years ago because that's really not my culture either. So if I'm a good relativist, I can't really judge anything because each person's choices are determined by their individual mix of cultural influences. Okay, so the last one always seems to throw people for a loop, and it's honestly the most sensible one. Determinism holds that for any event that occurs given prior events and the laws of nature, no other event could have occurred. That just means that every event has a cause. That's elementary stuff. I mean, we may not always know the cause, but it's there. So let's take the case of a hypothetical murder. Person X is shot and killed by person Y. Why? Well, I'm going to argue that this was inevitable, mostly by looking at the killer, that's person Y. The killing was sort of an impulse action. There was a fight, it escalated, and person Y pulled the trigger. It's worth knowing that person Y was born with fetal alcohol syndrome. That means that Y's mother ingested enough alcohol during gestation to affect fetal development. It's typically associated with learning difficulties and impulse control. Y also grew up with almost no supervision, therefore was absent from school more than half the time before dropping out. A lot of people carry guns. A lot of people get shot. But you start to see a wave of events that, while it might be really weird for someone like you to choose to fire a weapon, it's almost something you can see coming, kind of like a freight train. So how can we judge something that's inevitable? Like the saying goes, it is what it is. That's true for everything. You're watching this video because you're the type of person to watch this type of video. Why are you that type of person? Well, maybe because you were raised a certain way. Maybe because your parents contributed some sort of gene. How responsible are you for all that you do? Maybe you're just lucky to be having the experiences that you're experiencing. So here's the upshot. If you take one of these positions, then you're ending the possibility of having a conversation about ethical truth or finding common ground. So what let's do, let's just acknowledge that they exist, and then we're going to let them go for a little bit.